Stay tuned for a fascinating idea I saw in the Ramban with an unbelievable story that saved one of the biggest Rosh Yeshivas of our times.
Welcome to Prism of Torah with Rebbe Saf Aaron Prisman, engaging Divrei Torah, packed with stories and practical insights. Find us wherever you get your podcasts or at prismoftorah.org.
Shalom uvracha. As we start a new sefer, the Heilige Sefer Vayikra, which discusses all the different types of sacrifices. We start Parshas Vayikra this week, Yimirtz Hashem, and I would like to discuss with you a specific sacrifice. When a person sins, then he has to bring a sacrifice to atone for his sin. And the normal way of doing it is to bring an animal, to sacrifice an animal for his atonement. However, the Psukim teach us that there are certain situations when the person is poor and he doesn't have enough money to buy an animal for a sacrifice, he is indeed allowed to bring a different type, a type of sacrifice that's composed of a bird offering. The Pasuk says in Perek Aleph, Pasuk Yud Daled, that it can be the type of birds that one can bring is either torim, which is literally translated as turtle doves, or bnei yoina. Bnei yoina are young doves. What bothered me is surely there's something very specific that is behind the scenes over here to teach us. Why is Hashem deciding that for the poor person, it's these specific birds one has to bring? Does it really matter which birds? What's the idea behind it? So I searched and I found this fascinating Ramban. The Ramban over there on the Pasuk at the beginning says something very a technical point, which is, or a practical point, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu decided these two types of birds because they're easier to catch, they're not so far, they can be found easily accessible. But then he goes on to a deeper idea, and he says there's something amazing about each of these types in their quality. And not the same quality. Each one has its own unique characteristic. And Yimirtz Hashem will connect each one of these characteristics to why it's fitting that dafka these birds uniquely will be brought as a sacrifice for atonement. The torim, the turtle doves, says the Ramban, they mate for life. Unlike most animals or other birds, when one of the pair dies or is captured, the one that survives will try to find another partner, a new partner. However, the torim uniquely prefers to remain alone forever. That shows the type of idea of loyalty to the original partner. Then he goes on to say about the bnei yoina, the young doves, not the older doves, not the mature doves, but the younger doves. They have a different quality entirely. But I think there's a common denominator. Their quality is that no matter where they travel, no matter how far away, they will always return to their nest where they were hatched from. Not sometimes, but always. In fact, even in extreme situations, when the nest is destroyed, these young doves still return to that exact same spot. The Ramban then finishes the cycle by telling us that the mature yonim, they're rejected. Why? Because they, unlike the torim, they will switch partners. But the torim never switch partners, and the bnei yoina, they're young, they're still immature, and they haven't started the mating process. So when you look at the full picture, what the Ramban is telling us, there's a very, very clear pattern over here, which is both the torim and the bnei yoina, they represent loyalty. The torim represent loyalty to one's partner, which the Ramban explains that's a mashal, a parable for our relationship with Hashem, that we will always be loyal to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And the bnei yoina, they represent loyalty to one's origins, where he came from. We know that we came from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. HaKadosh Baruch Hu created us. He gave us the Torah. That is where we came from. Based on that, we can now understand our original question. What is it unique about these type of birds that the poor person can bring them as a sacrifice instead of the animal? Let's not forget, the Ramban also explains at the beginning that the whole idea of a sacrifice is the person should look at the animal and say, this is really what is deserving to happen to me after I sinned. When I sinned to Hashem, that's horrible. To a certain extent, I rebelled against Hashem. And therefore, what's happening to the animal is what should happen to me. And instead, it's happening to the animal. So you see the idea of the sacrifice being atoning, because it gets me to think and regret what happened. The Torah and the Bnei Yoina, that they carry with them this idea of loyalty, that acts to a certain extent as a vehicle for atonement, because it is in a way restoring our loyalty and reminding us that we have to be loyal to where we came from, and also loyal to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, who's our only partner. We say, Kudsha Buchu, Oraisa and Bnei Yisrael Chadu. Klal Yisrael, the Torah and HaKadosh Baruch Hu are one. We're one partner. No one can be instead of us. We're always connected to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And we know the core of that connection is the Heilige Torah. That's what HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave us. And now it's the blueprint for the world. The question was never really about birds. It was about what a korban, what a sacrifice is actually doing. The poor sinner created a certain crack in the relationship and the loyalty between him and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The Torah is saying to us, look at these birds. This is what you are supposed to look like, and learn loyalty and return to loyalty with Hashem. Obviously, if the Torah is hinting to us that the Bnei Yoina's loyalty to the nest that created them, that formed them, is very critical, how much more so is it true that a person has to carry the same loyalty towards whatever his spiritual nest was? That's where Rav Simcha Zissel Brody, the Rosh Yeshiva of Hebron Yeshiva, said this, that a person has to remember what cheder brought him up, what school, what yeshiva, what rebbe, what parents, what grandparents who brought him up into this world, that brought him up not only physically but also spiritually. How important is it for us to hold on and appreciate that connection, where we came from? We have to continuously remember who are the people and what are the places that shaped who we are. And we have to have a huge hakaras hatov and always return and keep a connection with those people. That will also ensure that we'll never get to a position where we sin. We would like to end with a story adopted from a story told over by Rav David Oizri. Rav Shach, the Rosh Yeshiva of Punovich, several decades ago, at this point in life was not in good health at all. He lived with his grandson. He was around 90 years old. Because his wife passed away, he lived with his grandson. One morning he woke up to a freezing cold day. It was pouring outside in Bnei Brak. But yet he still asked his grandson, please call a taxi for me to Haifa. His grandson said, that's no way, I'm not doing that. The Rosh Yeshiva is not feeling well. The weather is horrible. And Rav Shach, the Rosh Yeshiva is not feeling well. But Rav Shach insisted and said quietly, if there will be no taxi, I'll have to walk to the central bus station. So the grandson was left with no choice, and he indeed called a taxi. They arrived at a small funeral parlor in Haifa. A woman was being buried. There was barely a minyan there, so Rav Shach actually said the Kaddish. Then he asked the driver to follow everyone to the cemetery. His grandson begged him, please, let's go home now. I don't want the Rosh Yeshiva to get sick, standing outside over here in the cold. But Rav Shach got out of the taxi anyway, stood at the open grave, even after everyone else had left. On the way home, the grandson said, please, can you please explain to me what happened here? Rav Shach said, when he was 12 years old, he was accepted to yeshiva for the most gifted students. He was the youngest, very far from home, sleeping on the floor with no blanket. The winters were freezing. One day a letter arrived from a wealthy uncle. Come home, learn my trade. You can inherit everything. Because of the cold, Rav Shach actually decided he would leave after Shabbos to go work. But before Shabbos, on Friday morning, a woman arrived at the yeshiva with a wagon full of blankets. Her husband owned a blanket factory, and was killed in an accident. She wanted to donate everything to the yeshiva boys. Rav Shach received one of those blankets. That night he slept very warmly for the first time, and hence, based on that, in the morning he decided to stay. He stayed because of that one blanket. That woman that brought that blanket for him, that was the woman that was buried in Haifa. She survived the war, lost everything, moved to Haifa, never remarried, and died in poverty. Rav Shach sent her money over the years as a token of appreciation, and when he heard she passed away, he knew he had to come. Rav Shach then paused for a minute and explained why he stood alone at the grave after everyone left. He wanted to feel the cold again, the same cold he felt as a 12-year-old boy with no blanket. And why did he do that? Because he wanted his gratitude to be real, not just a memory, not a concept, but something he could feel again, how real it is. That is what a Kalas HaToiv is all about. Not a feeling you carry quietly inside, but something you stand in the freezing rain to make it real. That is what Rav Shach knew he had to do to ensure it stays with his emotions. The Bnei Yoina returned to their nest even after it was destroyed. Rav Shach also traveled to a cemetery in Haifa in the pouring rain to stand at the grave of a woman nobody remembered, just because she was the nest that made him. Have a good Shabbos.
This concludes another episode of the Prism of Torah. Thank you for tuning in today. We hope you enjoyed it and learned something valuable. If you did, please subscribe to the podcast and give a 5-star rating. You can also find this podcast wherever you get your podcasts or our own website, prismoftorah.com, where we have a full archive of all our past episodes. We would like to thank Yona Vefa for the recording equipment and Eli Podcast Productions for handling all our post-podcast productions. Join us next week for another enlightening conversation on the Prism of Torah.